just follow your curiosity, and we'll see what happens.
I love it. It's all improv, man. Hey, it's wonderful to meet you. Thank you
That's
so much
for
for
sure.
thanks for taking a minute out, man. I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes, sir. So let's get into your world, and to begin that process, I want to know, 5 years ago this pandemic changed so many things for all of us, especially journalists, people that are curious. How did you make it through the pandemic of 2020, and how has it affected the way that you live and do things now?
That's a really good question. And I almost feel bad saying that actually the pandemic for me was pretty good.
Yeah.
Obviously, it was traumatic for a lot of people and it changed lifestyles. I mean, I have friends who were, married for a long time. And then when they were stuck together, they realized we don't like each other. And it was just the opposite for my wife and me. We've been married we just passed our 47th anniversary. And so we were here, and Cindy's an introvert. I'm a shy extrovert with introvert tendencies. So, I worked in the basement and we started to have coffee together. I would get up early, get down here, work, and then about 8 in the morning, she'd say, "Could we have coffee?" And that's been going on for the last 5 years. And so we hang out for a couple hours doing the New York Times crosswords and or the puzzles and read Heather Cox Richardson and stuff like that. And the other thing that happened is that I started doing a podcast. And I'm an interviewer. I'm curious. I'm interested in other people. But with the Zoom technology, it was possible to reach out and connect with all kinds of people. And so I've still been doing that ever since as well.
Isn't the podcasting realm such a wonderful place to exist in for a little while?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it's like the thing about journalism, as you very well know, is that it's this polarizing realm. Like we're all drawn up as one side or the other. But when you really get into the guts of podcasting, you realize there's a lot of gray area and we're all kind of in the same boat. We all have a lot of the same things that we're going after and doing, and there's just an egalitarianism that exists in this world. I love it.
I do too, and I think egalitarianism is a perfect word. And I think you've also put your finger on something, and that is that, politics, especially now, is fraught. And
Yes.
so everything is really is stirred up. But I think that a lot of people, especially people in the middle, are turned off. It's like they're in the crossover or the flyover zone, and the two sides are fighting each other, and everybody else, maybe most of the country, is going, "Cut it out, guys."
Uh-huh.
Not that there aren't things that are really important to pay attention to, but I think that there's just a lot of political fatigue out there as well.
Totally agree. So you're obviously a journalist turned novelist and a podcaster, and I want to know this. If I put you in front of a bunch of 12-year-olds at career day and one of the kids in the room wanted to know what you did for a living, how would you explain it?
I'd say I have no idea what I do. Here's what I would say. Um, Rather than point to a career or something like that, I would say I'm doing what I'm good at and what I love, because I think that really should be the standard for deciding what you do in life. It's not about making money, because if you're doing what you're good at and what you love, things will come your way. And so I think all too often our society gets all hung up on, money making careers. And a lot of people I come across in my travels and in my the classes I teach and the people I know, these are people who went into high paying, high powered jobs and they hate them
Yeah,
because they were pressured, you can't be a writer because you're not going to make any money.
yeah.
And while that's true, um, they ended up going into something that made money but didn't make them happy.
Man, I love that answer. I'm coming off the fuselage of watching John Batiste last night. He had a concert in town, and that's what he is. He exudes
Oh
this
my God, absolutely.
impenetrable light and strength and virility of a creative soul that's doing exactly what he was created to do, and it comes off him because sometimes when you see concerts you're like they want to act blue collar, but they're multi million billionaires, but you don't get that from John. You get this idea that he is really keeping the torch going for all of the predecessors, and he's loving the craft. Like, there was a kid in front of us and my wife looked over and said, something to him, and he just looked bespectacled. It was at the end of the show. And I just looked over at him and I said, "This is proof to your generation that none of this is ever going to go away. There's always going to be somebody that's going to keep the love and keep that vigor going."
I love the phrase virility of the creative soul. Have
Yeah.
you considered writing?
I do a little bit on the side. Yeah.
That's a great phrase.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me ask you this. When you were 12 years old, what did you want to be when you grew up? What was your dream gig?
President of the United States.
Okay. Okay. So,
And Dan Rather.
okay. So was he your hero? Was he kind of the one that you looked
Yeah,
up
he
to?
was starting to emerge. I mean, probably, I think if now that you mention it, it's probably going more back to 63, 64. So when, that would have been 13 and 14. 12, I was still kind of, figuring it out. At 12, I wanted to be a lawyer. My dad was a lawyer. He and I were going to go into practice together. But I think after the Kennedy assassination, I began to think more about the presidency and merging law and politics.
So what was the step that finally made you get into journalism and writing? What was the moment?
Vietnam, the Vietnam War. I was
Okay.
a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison in 1968. That was the year that everything blew up because between 68 and 70, it was like the country was tearing itself apart. We had a draft. The Vietnam War was chewing up, it was killing 200 kids a week. I say kids, 18, 19, 20.
Yeah.
There were 500,000 troops in Vietnam at the time, very unpopular war. They had a draft, and if you had a number below 150, a lottery number below 150, you were going. And my number was 14. I had a student deferment, so that helped at least delay things. But bottom line, I was I would go to class and I was bombarded from both the left and the right to take a position on the war. And I didn't really have one. My parents were Nixon Republicans. UW-Madison was very liberal, which is not my background. And so when I was at home during the Thanksgiving break, I'd argue the left-wing line I was hearing at school. And when I was in the dorms in the bull sessions, I'd argue the right-wing line of my Nixon Republican parents. And when I was alone, I was confused. And so I volunteered at a campus radio station and promptly got tear gassed covering an anti-war riot and traded. My parents heard me on the radio and suggested that I should transfer schools, which I did. But Playboy magazine had voted UW-Madison the number one party school in the country, and I saw it as my mission to be the number one part. I didn't succeed, but I did so well at it that my grade point average was 1.95, that close to getting kicked out of school. And so I lost my student deferment. Long story short, I enlisted to avoid the draft. And probably the there's no pivotal moment, but I think that the epiphany was when I had orders to Vietnam. They were changed at the last minute to Germany, and I spent 2.5 years at the headquarters of the American Forces Radio and Television Network in Frankfurt, Germany, doing interviews for a special events radio unit. And the first interview I did was with a guy named Alfred Hitchcock. Maybe you've heard of him. And that was the moment when I realized I can do this. I'm good at it and I love it. And that's when I went into journalism.
Amazing. What was Alfred like? That had to be unbelievably, I don't even know what the word would be. Like that just threw me
Intimidating.
for, yeah.
Intimidating. He was just the way you would expect. He was huge. He was affable with, he had a dry sense of humor and he spoke very slowly. And he would be telling me, he'd been interviewed a gazillion times, so I knew I was getting canned answers. And I always felt that as an interviewer, you want to try to go deep and go, in a direction that maybe they haven't been asked. And in my research, I came up with something and I said, I've heard it said that you're afraid of death. Is that true? And he'd been giving these long answers and he goes, No, it's not true. And that's it. So I had to have a couple of follow-ups. And, he was gracious. He rolled with it and was 40 minutes with him one-on-one and life-changing.
Wow. I remember I was in the back of a water taxi in Venice, Italy on the morning of September 11th, 2001. In my mid-20s, I was backpacking across Europe, but I went to Paris on the 4th of September, and I will never forget an exhibit that I saw in a museum there for Hitchcock. And I walked into a room, and there was all of these glass cubes. There must have been like 50, and there was just a spotlight of light that came down, and there was the phone from Dial M for Murder. There was the knife from Psycho. It was one of the most
Wow.
fascinating exhibits, and to this day, it just absolutely it has captivated me. And just the way he did things, I don't think people understood the brilliance and prowess he had of capturing things in the illusionary world that he was making.
Exactly. And yet I think he also had a lot of self-doubt.
Yeah,
There's, the making of Psycho. I mean, he was wondering, is this going to be a flop? Do I have it in me again? And I think that's true of a lot of creative types. And it's so counterintuitive because, people with a track record of tremendous creativity can still doubt themselves when everybody else is going, "Oh, dude, you're wonderful."
yeah.
And there's something in you, that voice that goes, "Nah, you don't have it." And I think all too often, people, especially before they've really even started out to test that creativity, give up. And I think that's sad. That's really sad.
So, who was a mentor? Who was a hero, inspiration for you that developed this acumen you have in journalism and broadcasting, and just in general, to find your place right now in life?
Boy, I can't really put one single name on it. There have been several over the years, going back to Pete Lakin. Pete Lakin was the rock and roll disc jockey in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and a buddy and I were riding our bikes. We came across the transmitter, knocked on the door. I mean, it was this shack in the middle of a swamp, and he let us in. And I would that was my first peek behind the scenes of, what this is all about. And he would let me come out on weekends and watch him work. So shadowing him was great. Um, let's see. When I was in the Army, Herb Glover was the boss who assigned me to do the interview with Hitchcock. Herb had worked with Walter Cronkite at CBS. Herb could have done the interview in his sleep, and he trusted this kid not to screw it up. That
Yeah.
was a mentoring moment, and I learned a lot from Herb Glover. Let's see, Jim Hoyt was my journalism professor at the University of Wisconsin. He was working at NBC the night of the Watergate break-in, and he was, just on the desk. He was a new hire, and the crew called in from the courthouse and said, these guys with have been arrested for breaking into the Watergate, the Democratic headquarters, and they have ties to the White House. What should we do about it? And Jim goes, I don't know. And he goes to Carl Stern, who was the Justice Department correspondent for NBC. And Stern says, I'll make a few phone calls. Stern comes back to him and says, I just called John Mitchell, the Attorney General. He said it's no big deal. As it turns out, John Mitchell went to prison for helping to obstruct justice.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So I
Wow.
learned a lot just from Jim's stories and his guidance, and he really helped me get my first job in television. A lot of other mentors along the way.
I was talking to a good friend of mine the other day. When I got started in journalism, I was at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and was writing sports. And my editor at the time, his name was John Bedoin, we're good friends. And the other day I was like, what happened to journalism? Because we used to have this Watergate. We used to have Woodward and Bernstein. We had these powerful Cronkite voices that would not allow things to happen. And we're living in surreal times where Teflon is the key in DC now. And I was like, what happened? And he said, we there's too much out there. There's way too much internet and social media news going on. We have blurred that line between conspiracy and reality, and everybody's brains are scrambled.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, you can blame technology, or you can praise it. I think that the jury is still out. There are strengths and weaknesses and good and bad connected with it. And, journalism has always been impacted by technological advances. But we are now in a position where everyone with a cell phone is a publisher.
Hmm.
If you hit send or forward or share, you're publishing,
Yeah.
but there's no person on your shoulder going, how do you know that's true? Which
Uh-huh.
is what they have at reputable news organizations. Unlike what some presidents will tell you, it is a firing offense to make things up.
Yeah.
And that is still true at the Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and any number of other news organizations. But there's been such a proliferation of, for lack of a better term, this is a term of art, bullshit. There's just so much out there that how do you discern what's true and what's not?
Yeah. You know, I remember the morning Carl Castle retired from Morning
Yeah,
Edition on NPR,
yeah.
and he got asked the question. I don't know why this stuck. I do know why, but this has always stuck with me. They said, after all of these years that you've done this and been behind the microphone and done all of this wonderful work, what's the one thing that boils to the top? And he said, I never, ever reported on anything if I didn't have a corroborating source behind me. Of everything he could have said, he could have thanked all the presidents he interviewed. He could have thanked his boss, the seminal people in his life, but he was talking about journalistic integrity. That was the whole read between the lines. And I think we've just deviated from that in so many ways. And the public knows that. And I think there's a part of them that's like, the Watergate thing will never happen again. Not in any time soon as far as a big, far-reaching thing, because so many of these people are getting away with things that are absolutely clowny.
Yeah, I want to, I hope that you're wrong about
Me
that.
too.
And I'm not convinced you're right. I think that, the Epstein files, that's a story that has legs
Yeah,
and there's been a lot of reporting on it. It's not going away. It, kind of ebbs and flows, but that has Watergate possibilities.
yeah,
But you're right, journalism is changing a lot, and there's so much to cover with fewer resources that it does make a difference. I can remember on 9/11, there happened to be a camera crew in the CNN newsroom at the time shooting a promo stuff for us. And so they just were there documenting what was going on behind the scenes as we were scrambling to try to figure out what's going on. And there's a moment where the camera is focused on Bob Fernand, who was the senior executive producer of basically the coverage that was going on. And someone said to him, "There's a rumor that thus and so and this and that." And Fernand says, "We don't report rumors."
yeah,
And that's I think telling because that's in the thick of it. And
yeah,
you can say in the heat of battle, you want to go with whatever's, juiciest, blah, blah, blah. But, there's, as you say, there's journalistic integrity. And integrity says you go with what you're sure of, with reliable information, not rumors. Rumors you track down
yeah.
and find out if there's anything to it. But just because it's a rumor shouldn't justify it going on the air.
So speaking of Alfred Hitchcock, when you moved from that high peak of the first interview, was there anybody else that you went in and you were a little nervous and unsure, but it turned into a field of flowers, something that made you grow, that turned stellar unexpectedly?
Possibly that's hard to put my nobody's ever asked me that question exactly that way.
Yeah,
So the nearest I can come up with is I was covering the White House when Reagan was president, and we did a piece on it was we followed Larry Speaks around for a day. Larry was Reagan's press secretary at the time, and we followed him around for a day doing a piece on the White House press corps versus the president. And this was not planned, but Larry said, "Would you like to go into the Oval Office?" I go, "You think?" And he said, "Let me check and see." And he comes back in a few minutes and says, it's all clear." So we got a chance to follow Larry into the Oval Office. And this was as much for Larry as it was for us, because Larry was able to sit at the Resolute desk, shoot the breeze with Reagan while we got our B-roll. And when and I had a really good shooter, Tony Black, who'd been in the Oval Office a lot on these pool shoot sprays. And so Tony knew enough to have the camera rolling the whole time.
yeah,
And I mean, the whole time, meaning 2 minutes and 38 seconds. And so Larry and Reagan are schmoozing, blah, blah, blah. And when I was pretty clear that Tony got his shots, I asked Reagan a couple of questions. And I mean, this is sort of audacious. And I got in about three questions or so, and I got my sound bite because I basically, got Reagan to say that, sometimes it's frustrating dealing with the press corps because he says sometimes it seems like less of a hunt for news than they're out to get you.
Uh-huh.
And that's a good quote. And the takeaway from that was, and this actually, I guess, if I think it really does answer your question because all six of my mystery suspense thriller novels have journalism as a backdrop,
Yeah.
and three of them are set at the White House. And the takeaway for me from that piece that I did is that it is an adversarial relationship.
Yeah.
It's Larry's job to make Reagan and his policies look perfect.
Hmm.
It's our job as reporters to find out what's really going on.
Yeah.
And so, by nature, that's going to be in conflict. So, no matter who's the president or what party, they're not going to always be happy with what you're covering.
Yeah.
And that was an important takeaway. And as it's turned out, my books give people a sense of what journalism is all about. Little did I know that it was going to become as, controversial and as important as it is.
When did you just decide to cross that threshold from journalism into writing novels? What was the moment? When did you decide that was going to be your world?
Oh, I love that question because it's not long after they made me an editor at CNN. I'd been a reporter, then I joined CNN as a writer in 1988, and within 9 months, they made me an editor. The guy who recruited me says, "You'd be a great editor," when what he really meant is, "I want off nights and weekends, and you'd be a great warm body to
Right.
replace me." So, he got the 9 to 5 Monday to Friday shift. I did overnights for the next 17 years. And it was tedious, but it paid well. It
Yeah.
was fault finding, and I needed a creative outlet. And so that's when I started learning to write fiction. And it's not easy to start making things up because it's a firing offense. So it took me 10 years to actually get my first book published. And by the time the third one was coming out, I left CNN. I retired after 25 years in 2013 and glided into a second career of writing novels and also as a manuscript editor, writing coach, and all that.
So is truth stranger than fiction in your estimation?
I think they go hand in hand, but
Okay.
I think truth informs fiction
Yeah.
because one of the things I teach is that writing is like dipping a straw into your subconscious, and you're stirring up all kinds of stuff that is part of your personal experience, the truth that you live, but it's unconscious. And when you ask those what if questions, it stirs things up. Then, and that's like taking a sip and it comes through your fingers and onto the page. So truth and fiction, I think, are handmaids.
Okay. So when you went into being a novelist, you have this idea. We have these ideological constructs of what we're going to pursue and how it's going to turn out. And then it actually happens. What's been the middle area between your this world you constructed of what that life would be like and what it's actually turned out to be?
Do you mean in terms of career or in terms of calling or
Yeah, just
how that works
revelations
out?
you have, how it's happened, how it contrasts to being a journalist, how did it materialize, so to speak?
Uh, I'm going to riff on this one because
Yeah,
I think that the answer is life is improv.
yeah,
And we have a structure, we have an idea of maybe what's going to go on, but all too often things happen that are unexpected, and we have to respond and deal with it. And I think that's been a lesson that has taken me a long time to learn. And it happened, I think, when I started to experiment playing jazz drums. But it really spills over into creativity as well. I can have an idea of where I'm going with a novel, but I don't think things through as carefully as I'd like. And so I have to just sort of get my characters talking to each other, use the syntax and the tools in my kit to make something happen. And it's no different when you're playing jazz with somebody.
yeah.
You have your vocabulary, and the problem with jazz is that my vocabulary is see Dick run. you know there's if you don't mind, I want to tell a quick story about
Oh yeah.
improv
Yeah.
because this was a moment. My son James is he was the jazz drummer in college when he was in school, and he's got chops.
Yeah.
And he dropped out of school to be with a band. It was sort of an indie rock band, and we had a heart to heart. And I said, dude, college will be there, but this is an opportunity. So he went for it. He traveled the country a couple of times. So he was visiting me in DC, and we went to HR 57, which was a jazz club,
Yeah.
and they had an open mic jam session. And I said to James, "Are you going to go play?" And he goes, "No, I should have listened." I go swaggering up there. I take the sticks from the house drummer. They call something, it's 4/4, medium swing. I can do that. So
Yeah.
we're doing it. Everything's wonderful. Then a couple of horn players get up. I find out later they had just played a gig at the Kennedy Center. So I'm in over my head, but I don't know it.
Right.
So they call something and they count it down and they're flying and I'm still taxiing, right? You know you're in trouble when during the song the house drummer goes, "I'll take over."
Oh
So here
no.
I am trying. I know it was a major fail.
No.
And so that was a real lesson in being able to fail and learn from it.
Yeah.
So what I did is I joined the jazz workshop run by Paul Piper in Fairfax, Virginia.
Yeah.
And Paul brings together musicians for 2 hours a week to play jazz. Little did I know that improv is part of it, and failing is, a regular moment by moment occurrence. And so I learned a lot about failing and not being worried about that, but just
Yeah.
rolling with it and learning from it. You know, I'm never going to be Buddy Rich
Yeah.
or anything close to that,
Yeah.
but I did learn to have more confidence and not be afraid of failure.
What was the first live jazz show you saw that blew you away?
Well, let's see. I'm thinking BB King, but that's blues.
But that's still, I mean, yeah, jazz blues.
I would say, I don't know, probably Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Okay.
I mean, that's late 60s, then, and that's when the Chop 40, I mean, I was a DJ back in the late 60s when the oldies were newies, and of
Yeah.
course, what goes up, what was that? Spin and Wheel. I mean, that was their number one hit, and that's jazz.
Yeah.
Chicago,
Yeah.
very jazzy. Uh,
Absolutely.
and so, and I think Take Five, Dave Brubeck. I mean,
Yeah.
that was probably the first one. And, Ramsey Lewis, the
Yeah.
In Crowd. I'm talking about spillover stuff that got into the top 40,
Yeah.
but it was jazz.
Yeah.
Now it's so nichified.
I know. It sure is. So, how did all of these years of being a journalist and being curious lead to this musicality that you have? What was the leap that made you do this? And was it hard to figure out the rhythm and timing?
I think that the catalyst was 1964 when the Beatles hit. Ringo Starr taught me how to play drums. He doesn't know it, but I was enamored with the drums, and
Yeah.
I just listened over and over again until I was able to figure out what he was doing. So, I taught myself that because of the Beatles.
Yeah. Let me ask you this from a journalistic standpoint. Was there anybody you were afraid to interview? Did you ever hit that moment where you're like, I don't know, man?
Mm-mm.
No?
No, there's anticipation, there's, a little trepidation, but no, I can't think of anybody.
So when I see Ed Bradley with Bob Dylan, I'm like, uh-huh. I mean, that was a moment where I could feel it. I could cut through it as a viewer. That's probably one of the most intense conversations I've seen on camera.
Here's the thing. People are just people,
Right.
and we tend to put them on pedestals, and in some cases for good reason, but they are they are human. They have struggles, they have shortcomings, they have talents. And I think that if we can try to level the playing field and, recognize talent and recognize greatness, but still be able to make a connection, I think that really should be the goal. And it works both ways.
Yeah.
People can be intimidated by someone who's wonderful, and someone who's wonderful can be disdainful of the people who put them on the pedestal.
Yeah.
So, there needs to be, a willingness to meet on the same level.
The beauty of the jazz world, though, is the higher up you go, the more humble and grounded and wonderful they are. Like Sonny Rollins was one of the most grounded, humble humans. Randy Weston. There's so many of those elder cats that I call the Jazz Jedi Council. They're in Cloud City. They're just
There's another turn of phrase,
that's
Jedi.
they're just looking down on us. They got all these chlorides in their blood, and they're just cool cats that want to pass this enormous gift of an art form that was curated in America to the younger generations. And you
Yeah.
feel it; it pulses through them.
Yeah, they're gifted. It's a
Yeah,
gift. And that goes back to doing what you're good at and what you love, and they've been able to tap into that.
yeah, they certainly have. So, of everything that you've seen and done and accomplished in your life, and more importantly, evolved to, what are you the proudest of?
Staying married for 47 years. Not only staying married, but staying faithful.
Yeah,
That was to be honest with you, that was the big fear when Cindy was coming down the aisle. I knew who I was before I got married,
yeah.
and I didn't want to be that person again. But, I'm a guy. And so that was a big fear. Can I stay faithful? And, so far, so good. That doesn't mean that there haven't been temptations, but yeah, I think monogamy is overrated. It's not overrated. It can't be rated highly enough.
Right.
There's a certain depth to being with someone that long. They
I
know you, they know everything. And there's a certain comfort and comfortability in that. I'm not saying it very well because I don't rhapsodize on this that much, but yeah,
I dig what you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
So
I'll
let
quit while I'm ahead.
Yeah, that's right. So let me ask you this. If you had a dream tonight, ran into the 18-year-old version of you, ready to go out into the world and to change things and to go after your dreams, and you could give that version of you a piece of advice based on this life you've lived, the wisdom you've accumulated, what advice would you impart?
Don't be afraid.
Yeah,
And if you are afraid, go forward anyway. There's sort of what I call a fear continuum. There's recklessness. That's the example I gave when I went up and played drums and didn't have a clue what I was doing.
yeah,
That was recklessness. No one died. But some people can die if you're reckless. If you're cautious, that's fear. There's fear there. You're counting the cost. Can this kill me, make me bankrupt, ruin my health? So counting the cost is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Cowardice is when you know what you should do and you freeze up.
yeah,
And then there's courage. I think that's the goal. But courage is not the absence of fear. I mean, the perfect example is, Normandy on D-Day. The guys who stormed the beaches, were they afraid? They were terrified,
yeah.
but they went forward anyway. That's fear in action. So my advice is recognize what you're afraid of and understand why you're afraid. Chances are you're afraid of failure or not being perfect or being judged. And those are all worthy things to be afraid of, but it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
And so go forward anyway, because the byproduct is courage and confidence. And you won't get it without facing your fears and pushing forward.
Well said. So at the end of the day, John, everyone has a perception of you. Family, friends, everyone that you've worked with, everyone that gets your novels knows you as a journalist, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Trying. I'm trying.
Yeah.
Um, I'm a connector and I'm a communicator and I'm an encourager. And I hope that, when everything's over, I hope there'll be a legacy of people who came away from our interactions, whether it's through books or conversations or whatever, feeling that in some way I encourage them.
Who would be the one person on the planet right now that you haven't interviewed that you would love to talk to? You would love to interview?
I'd like to talk to Barack Obama.
Yeah, love to join you.
Yeah, but that's just one of many.
Yeah, for sure. If anybody wants to delve into your wonderful world of novels, your work, anything in your world, where's the best place to go?
Best place is my website, which is johndedakis.com, John, D as in dog E, D as in dog A, DADAKIS as in Sam.com, JohnDeDakis.com.
And I'll make it easy. I'll put it in the show notes. John, this has been an absolute thrill and an honor. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Joe. It's been fun.
Absolutely. Thank you.